The first thing Renata Oakes noticed was the smell. Not the usual property room smell, that particular blend of mildew and gun oil, and the faintly sweet rot of things sealed in plastic too long, but something else underneath it. Something chemical and faintly metallic, like a road flare recently extinguished. She was standing at the intake counter at 7:14 on a Tuesday morning in November, still wearing her coat, signing for a chain of custody transfer on 17 evidence bags from an overnight arrest, when it hit her. She signed the form, took the bags, watched the patrol officer, young kid, name tag said GRUBER, head back through the security door with his empty evidence cart. Then she stood there a moment, holding the bags, not quite sure what to do with the feeling that had arrived alongside the smell. She set the bags in intake staging and went to make coffee. Briar Falls, Ohio is the kind of city that gets described as mid-sized in government reports and struggling in newspaper articles, which is a polite way of saying it used to be a place people came to and is now a place people leave. The population peaked in 1979 at just over 94,000 and has been declining steadily since, like a slow leak in something that nobody bothered to fix. The steel plant closed in 1991. 2 hospitals merged into one in 2006. The downtown has a few restaurants, a law office, a bail bondsman, and a vape shop that moved into what used to be a children's clothing store. The people who stayed are, for the most part, people who had nowhere else to go or people who loved the place enough to watch it age. The Briar Falls Police Department operates out of a 4-story building on Kerrigan Street, with a leaking roof on the 3rd floor and parking that hasn't been resurfaced since the Clinton administration. There are 187 sworn officers, 1 K-9 unit whose dog is 11 years old and partially deaf, a records division run by a woman named Carla who has worked there longer than the building's current roof has existed, and a property and evidence division that employs 4 people. Renata Oakes is the senior clerk. She has been there 14 years. She is 46 years old. She has flat, dark eyes and short, natural hair going gray at the temples and hands that are always slightly dry from the latex gloves. She was married once briefly in her early 30s to a man who sold insurance and thought he was funnier than he was. She has a 15-year-old daughter named Simone who plays varsity volleyball and is smarter than anyone Renata has yet introduced her to. Renata drives a 2017 Subaru Forester with 112,000 miles on it and a cracked rear bumper from a parking lot incident she still thinks about occasionally. She does not drink. She does not complain. She goes to bed at 10:30 most nights and wakes at 5:45 without an alarm, and she has spent 14 years in a basement room full of other people's worst days, cataloging them, numbering them, making sure they don't disappear. She is not dramatic about any of this. She does not think of herself as a guardian or a keeper of truth. She thinks of herself as someone who does her job correctly because doing your job incorrectly is an insult to everyone the job exists to serve. The evidence log discrepancy that started everything was not dramatic either. It was a Tuesday in mid-October, 3 weeks before the November morning with the smell, and Renata was conducting a routine audit. The department required quarterly audits of a random sample, 10% of active case evidence, which mostly existed on paper as a policy requirement and which most evidence clerks before Renata treated accordingly. She did not. She pulled the full sample, cross-referenced the physical inventory against the digital log and the paper chain of custody forms, and sat in the cage under the fluorescent light with a clipboard and a mechanical pencil, and went through each item methodically. Most of it was fine. It almost always was. The errors you found in evidence rooms were typically clerical: a bag numbered wrong, a weight recorded in grams when it should be milligrams, an officer's name misspelled. Human error, correctable, no malice required to explain it. What she found on item 4417B was not a clerical error. Case number 4417 was a narcotics arrest from March of the previous year. A man named Calvin Doss had been arrested with what the arrest report described as approximately 340 grams of methamphetamine in a backpack left in a parking garage on 5th Street. He had been charged, had pled out to a reduced charge of possession with intent, and was currently serving a 4-year sentence at Richland Correctional. The case was closed. The evidence, per department protocol, should still be retained during the period of incarceration. The arrest report said 340 grams. The evidence log entry said 340 grams. The chain of custody form said 340 grams. The physical evidence bag in slot 4417B, when placed on the scale, read 287 grams. 53 grams missing. Not a rounding issue, not a scale calibration issue. She checked the calibration log and then checked it with a verified weight. The scale was accurate to within 1/10 of a gram. She sat with that number for a while, 53 grams. The bag was sealed, but when she looked at it under good light, she could see that the original evidence tape, the blue tamper-evident tape the department used, had been replaced. The new tape was the same brand, the same color, but it was running slightly off the diagonal of the old tape's ghost, the faint adhesive shadow left behind when you peeled the first layer off. You would not notice it unless you were looking. She had not been looking for it. She had been looking at weights, and the weight had made her look at everything else. She wrote down the number in her notebook. She wrote down the case number. She did not say anything to anyone. Then she kept auditing. By the end of that first day, she had found 3 more discrepancies. 2 were minor enough that she flagged them for review and moved on. The third was not. Case 3891, a gun trafficking arrest from the prior February. The arrest report listed 11 handguns seized from a storage unit. The evidence log said 11. The physical count in 2 evidence bags secured in the long item cage was 9, 2 guns gone, not miscounted, not misfiled in another slot. Gone. She locked up the property room at 4:45, put her clipboard in her desk drawer, and drove home through the early dark of Ohio in October. She made dinner. She watched Simone eat and complain about a history teacher and then go back to her room to study. She washed the dishes and stood at the kitchen window for a while looking at the neighbor's fence. She had worked in the property room of the Briar Falls Police Department for 14 years. In that time she had seen things, not dramatic things usually, small things accumulated. She knew which officers were careful with evidence and which ones weren't. She knew which detectives read the rules like they applied to them and which ones read them like they were suggestions. She knew, in the way that people who work in rooms at the center of a machinery know, how the gears of that machinery actually turned versus how the manual said they were supposed to. She did not have a plan yet, but she had her notebook. Over the next 2 weeks, she audited everything she could reach without triggering a full system audit request, which would require supervisory sign-off and which she was not ready to do yet. She worked through lunch. She stayed 40 minutes late 3 days in a row and claimed she was reorganizing the storage system, which was true in the sense that you can reorganize something by understanding it better. What emerged from her notebooks was not a random pattern of clerical error. It was a shape, a very specific shape with a discernible center. 12 cases over 18 months, all narcotics, all serious weight, the kind of cases that move through the system quickly and quietly that defendants pled out on rather than fight, because fighting a meth case with a public defender in Briar Falls County is a specific kind of futile. The missing evidence was always a partial reduction, never total removal, which would have triggered a log alarm. Always enough gone to be profitable. Never enough gone to make the bag look obviously wrong on a cursory check. In 11 of the 12 cases, the chain of custody forms for the evidence listed the same 2 names in the receiving officer columns. Detective First Grade William Pruitt and his partner, Officer Raymond Carso. She had worked around Pruitt for 9 years. She knew his voice, the specific way he sighed when filling out paperwork, the cologne he wore that arrived 30 seconds before he did. He was 53, heavyset with thinning copper hair and a reddish face and the kind of low, authoritative manner that people often confuse with competence. He had been with the department for 26 years. He had a commendation plaque in the hallway near the elevator and a photo with the mayor taken at some kind of ceremony 4 years ago. He was liked. He told good stories at the precinct Christmas party. His wife volunteered at the food bank. She sat in the property room under the fluorescent light with her notebooks, and she thought about what you do when you find what she had found. You don't go to his supervisor, not until you understand who his supervisor talks to. You don't go to internal affairs, not at this stage, not with notebooks. You don't talk to your coworkers, your friends, your ex-husband who calls occasionally to complain about his new wife and who has no idea what a chain of custody form is. You go home, you make dinner, you look at the fence, and you think about what you're actually holding and how fragile it is, and you figure out how to make it less fragile before you do anything with it. The federal angle was not something she planned, it happened because of a form. On the 1st of November she received, as she did every first of the month, a joint data reconciliation request from the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation as part of a statewide evidence integrity initiative that had been running for 3 years and which everyone in the department treated as a bureaucratic nuisance. You submitted a report, they processed it, nothing usually happened. The form went back and forth like a piece of lint in a dryer. Renata had been filling out these forms for 3 years. She filled them out carefully because she filled out everything carefully. But this month, looking at the form, she looked at the contact information at the bottom, BCI Evidence Integrity Unit, a phone number, and then below it, a secondary contact line for the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, Regional Office, Columbus. She read that line 3 times. She had read it before every month and never thought about it. She thought about it now. She wrote the number in the back of her notebook, under a grocery list. She called from her car, parked in the lot of a Kroger 2 miles from her house, on a Saturday morning when Simone was at a volleyball tournament in Dayton. She was not sure what she expected. She half expected voicemail or a recording or some bureaucratic process that would take weeks before a human being was involved. A woman answered on the second ring. Public corruption, this is Agent Mercer. Renata had rehearsed what she was going to say. She said it more or less, though it came out smaller than she'd practiced, sitting in the Kroger parking lot while a man loaded groceries into a minivan across the row. She said she worked in evidence for the Briar Falls PD. She said she had found discrepancies in evidence logs that appeared systematic. She said she had documentation. She said she had not told anyone else and had not accessed anything outside her normal duties. There was a pause. How long have you been employed there? Agent Mercer asked. 14 years. Another pause. Can I call you back on this number in 5 minutes? Yes. She sat in the parking lot and watched the man with the minivan drive away. A woman walked past with a cart full of Halloween candy on clearance. Renata's phone rang in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. Special Agent Dana Mercer was 38 years old, compact and quick-voiced, with the particular efficiency of someone who has learned not to waste time on preamble. She had been with the FBI's Columbus field office for 6 years, the last 3 of them in the Public Corruption Unit, which meant she had spent 3 years working cases that moved slowly, involved powerful people with good lawyers, and required a level of evidentiary patience that most agents consider the opposite of exciting. She did not consider it the opposite of exciting. She considered it the only kind of work that mattered. She drove to Briar Falls on a Wednesday, 3 days after the call. She met Renata at a Panera on Route 9, the kind of generic chain restaurant where no one from the department would have a reason to be, and she sat across from her in a corner booth and listened. Renata had brought photocopies. Not originals, she was careful about that. Photocopies of the audit worksheets, the chain of custody forms, the evidence log entries. She had organized them in a manila envelope with a handwritten index on the inside flap. She slid the envelope across the table and watched Mercer open it and look through the contents without picking up any of the pages, just tilting the envelope to see better. You made these copies on a personal device? Mercer asked. My phone. The originals are in the files. And no one else at the department has seen this? No. Mercer looked at the envelope for a moment. You understand that once this moves forward, it's going to come back to you. There's no way to structure this investigation that doesn't eventually put you as the person who found the discrepancies. I know. And you understand that can get complicated. I know. Mercer looked at her. Renata looked back. There was a long pause where a Panera employee dropped something metal in the kitchen and it rang across the restaurant. Okay, Mercer said, tell me about William Pruitt. What Renata could tell her was limited to what she had observed in the evidence room over 9 years and what she had found in the files over the past 3 weeks. She was precise about the line between those 2 categories. When Mercer pressed her on something outside that line, Renata said so. She said it quietly, without apology. Mercer noted this. It was the thing she noted about sources, the ones who were careful about the edges of their own knowledge, who didn't expand to fill the space of your expectations, were the ones who tended to hold up. What Renata knew was this: Pruitt had signed evidence into the property room on all 12 cases. He had done so following proper procedure: seal present, form complete, officer signature legible. He had also, in 9 of the 12 cases, returned to the property room on subsequent dates for what the request logs described as case review. These returns were logged, per department procedure, with a time in and time out. In all 9 cases, the missing evidence had been in bags that Prout had personally reviewed. Carso's name appeared on 6 of the original intake forms as the secondary officer. He had made 3 of the subsequent review visits himself. Review visits require supervisor approval, Renata said. Were they approved? They have approval signatures, but the signature on 3 of Carso's visits is Prout's. Mercer looked up from her notepad. Prout authorized Carso's access to evidence in cases where Prout was the lead detective.
Yes.
Is that normal? It's technically within procedure. A lead detective can authorize a partner's access, but it's not common. Usually a supervisor signs off. Mercer was quiet for a moment, writing, "Who's Prout's supervisor?" "Lieutenant Gaffney, Dennis Gaffney." "His name appear anywhere in your audit?" "Not in the chain of custody logs, but Gaffney signs the case closures on 4 of the 12 cases. That's his normal job. He signs closures for all detectives in the unit. It doesn't prove anything." "No," Mercer said, "it doesn't." She closed her notepad. She looked at Renata's coffee, which Renata had not touched. "Can you keep doing your job normally until you hear from me?"
Yes.
"And you'll contact me immediately if anything changes. If Prout or Carso makes any unusual requests, if anyone comes to you asking about the audit, if anything feels different." "Okay." "How long have you known something was wrong?" Mercer asked, not writing now, just asking. Renata considered the question. "I've known something was wrong with 2 or 3 of those cases for probably 2 years. I didn't know it was a pattern until the audit." "Why didn't you report the individual cases?" "A missing gram here and there I could explain. A calibration error, a processing loss, I had doubt." "And now you don't." Renata picked up her coffee. It was cold. She set it back down. "Now I have 12 cases." November passed slowly. Mercer called twice, both times on Renata's cell, both times brief. She said the investigation was moving. She said Renata should continue as normal. She said if anything felt dangerous, not just uncomfortable but dangerous, she should call immediately. Nothing felt dangerous, everything felt like waiting. On the 19th of November, Prout came into the property room at 2:30 in the afternoon to check out an evidence bag for court prep on a case that was going to trial the following week. He was wearing a blue sport coat and smelled like coffee and his usual cologne, something with cedar in it. He stood at the counter while Renata processed the request, and he talked about the Browns, who had lost the previous Sunday, in a way he described as almost impressive in how bad it was. She agreed that it was something. She processed the paperwork. She handed him the bag. He thanked her, called her Nettie, which he had always called her and which she had never corrected because it was the kind of familiarity that costs more to refuse than to absorb. He left. She stood at the counter for a moment after he was gone, and then she went back to work. She thought about the word normal, Mercer's word. She had been trying to figure out if she was acting normal, if her behavior had shifted in any way Prout might notice. She didn't think so. She had been quiet and careful and exactly what she had always been, which was the kind of person that men like Prout don't look at twice because she had been in that room for 14 years and was part of the furniture. She found that right now, she was grateful for that. The FBI moved in December. Not all at once. They moved in the way federal investigations move when they're done carefully, which is quietly and in layers like sediment. Mercer had explained some of it in one of their brief calls. Grand jury subpoenas for financial records, coordination with BCI on the statewide audit data, a deeper examination of the physical evidence, brought in external forensic consultants to examine the tamper-evident tape on 16 bags, not just the 12 from Renata's audit. The results of the tape examination came back in the 3rd week of December. 14 of the 16 showed adhesive shadowing consistent with removal and reapplication. On December 21st, 4 days before Christmas, Renata received a call from Mercer at 8:45 in the morning while she was sorting intake from the overnight arrests. "I need you to do something for me today," Mercer said. "Okay." "I need you to pull the original chain of custody forms for the 12 cases in your audit, not copies, the originals, and I need you to sequester them per your department's protocol for documents under legal hold." I can do that. Do it before noon, and then go about your day. What's happening? A brief pause, we're moving to the next stage. She didn't ask what the next stage was. She pulled the forms. She completed the legal hold sequestration, which required filling out a form she had filled out perhaps twice in 14 years, and she filed it with records, where Carla took it with the expression of someone who understood its significance but chose to file it anyway because that was her job. They arrested Carso on a Thursday in January. Not at the department. At his house on Elmfield Drive at 6:15 in the morning while it was still dark, while the street smelled of wood smoke and old snow and the neighbors' holiday lights were still up even though it was 3 weeks past Christmas. Federal agents and county sheriff's deputies, an arrest warrant and a search warrant, a vehicle parked in the driveway with the windows fogged. Renata heard about it from her colleague Marcus, who heard from his girlfriend who worked at County Dispatch. Marcus came in at 7:30 and told her while they were both still in their coats standing near the coffee maker. He was excited in a way that made him speak quickly and touch his forehead. "Carso," he said, "FBI, they took him this morning." Renata said, "No kidding. You know what for?" "No," she said, which was true. She didn't know the formal charges yet. She made her coffee. The department spent the rest of the day in the particular suspension of a place where something significant has happened, and no one is authorized to confirm what. The sergeant at the front desk answered calls with a carefully neutral voice. The union rep was seen getting on the elevator 3 times in the morning. Lieutenant Gaffney's office blinds were closed, which was unusual. The hallway outside the detective division had the quality of a room where everyone is performing stillness. Prout was there. She passed him twice. Once near the elevator where he was talking to 2 other detectives and stopped mid-sentence when she walked by, then resumed. Once near the vending machines where he was alone getting a Pepsi and he looked at her with an expression she spent a while afterward trying to read. Not suspicious, exactly, not accusatory. More like a man running a very quick internal calculation, the kind you do when something surprises you and you're trying to figure out what the surprise means. "Crazy morning," he said. "Sounds like it," she said. She kept walking. Prout was not arrested that day or the next. The investigation was still building. This was something Mercer had told her in the abstract and that she now understood concretely. When you're building a federal corruption case, you don't arrest everyone at once unless you have to. You arrest the one who will give you the others, or you build until you have enough to take everyone simultaneously and foreclose the possibility of a warning shot being fired down the line. Carso was the lower rank. He had been with the department 7 years, had a young family, had presumably less financial cushion and less institutional insulation. He was the one who might talk. She didn't know if he talked. Mercer didn't tell her. What Mercer told her was that the investigation had expanded and that Renata's role in it was going to become more formal. "We're going to need a formal statement," Mercer said. "And we're going to have to disclose your identity to the AUSA's office." That's the U.S. Attorney. "I understand what an AUSA is." "Right, sorry." "Will the department know?" "Not yet, but eventually, yes. When the case moves toward indictment, it will be part of the record." Renata was quiet on the phone. She was in her car again. She had started doing calls from her car in the Kroger parking lot, not because it was necessarily more secure, but because it was the one place she could be alone without it being unusual. "How long is eventually?" 3 to 4 months, best case, could be longer." "Okay." "Are you all right?" Mercer asked. "I'm fine. If you want to take some time, if it gets too uncomfortable at the department." "I'm fine," Renata said again, not harshly, just factually. "I'm going to keep going in." She continued going in. She continued doing her job. She continued signing for evidence transfers and processing intake and conducting her portion of the quarterly audit and making coffee in the small room off the evidence cage where a mini fridge held her lunch and a wall calendar from a local auto shop showed February's photo of a modified pickup truck. What changed was something she couldn't quite name. A quality of attention around her that was new. She noticed it first with Gaffney, Lieutenant Dennis Gaffney, who had been her supervisor for 8 years in the loose, mostly administrative sense that a lieutenant with 37 subordinates supervises anyone. He had never paid much attention to her. He had the preoccupied benevolence of a man who thinks of support staff as background. But in February, he came to the property room twice in a single week with questions about audit procedures that he had never asked before and could have gotten from the written policy. Both times he stood at the counter and talked to her in a friendly, conversational way, slightly too friendly, asking about the BCI reconciliation report and whether there had been any unusual requests or discrepancies lately. "Nothing out of the ordinary," she said both times. Which was technically true, because she had stopped auditing anything beyond her required duties and was moving through the days with the careful ordinariness of someone who has learned to keep their face neutral by keeping their thoughts neutral. Gaffney was 58, lean with close-cropped gray hair and the posture of a man who spent his 20s in the military and never entirely left. He was a different kind of authority than Prout, quieter, less sociable, watchful in a way that Prout, who preferred to be watched himself, was not. When he spoke, he used fewer words. When he listened, he went very still. She had always been mildly uncomfortable around Gaffney, not because he'd done anything, just because he was the kind of person who noticed things and she was currently the kind of person who could not afford to be noticed. The second time he came to the counter at the end of the second visit, he said, "You're a careful worker, Renata." It wasn't a question, it wasn't an accusation. It was just a sentence said in a friendly voice that he let sit there between them for a moment before he thanked her and left. She thought about that sentence for a long time. On the 14th of March, a federal grand jury in Columbus returned indictments against Raymond Carse on 12 counts of evidence tampering and 2 counts of obstruction of justice. The indictment was under seal until the morning of the 17th, when it was unsealed and became public record simultaneously with a second set of indictments that the U.S. Attorney's Office released in a press conference at 9 a.m. The second set was for William Prout. 22 counts: evidence tampering, theft of government property, conspiracy. 2 additional counts related to testimony he had given in a preliminary hearing on one of the 12 cases, testimony about evidence weight that was now provably false. The third name on the indictment was Dennis Gaffney. 8 counts: conspiracy, obstruction, abuse of official capacity. The prosecutors alleged that Gaffney had known about the scheme for at least 14 months and had actively prevented an internal review that had been requested by a BCI auditor in the spring of the previous year. A review request that Renata had not known about, had not been told about, that had been submitted through channels above her, and had been quietly redirected by Gaffney to cursory file review that found nothing because it was designed to find nothing. She sat in her car in the Kroger parking lot at 9:20 that morning listening to the press conference on her phone through a local news livestream. The U.S. attorney was a man named Harlan Bryce, 50-ish, with a measured Midwestern cadence that made everything he said sound like the conclusion to something long and carefully considered. He talked about the integrity of the evidence system. He talked about the defendants. He talked about the investigation. And then he said, "We would not have been able to develop this case without the cooperation of a member of the Briar Falls Police Department's Property and Evidence Division, who came forward with information about systematic discrepancies and demonstrated extraordinary professional integrity in doing so. We owe this person a significant debt." He didn't say her name. Mercer had told her he wouldn't, but within 48 hours it wouldn't matter. She went into work that day. She didn't know afterward if that was the right decision, but at the time it felt like the only decision she was capable of making because the alternative, staying home, waiting by the phone, watching news coverage, was not a thing she could do. She parked in the lot. She signed in at the desk. She went downstairs to the property room and started her day. By 10:15, the news was on every screen in the break room and people were standing in the hallway outside the detective division in small groups speaking quietly. By noon, her direct supervisor, not Gaffney, who was on administrative leave pending the processing of the indictment, but a sergeant named Wicks who had been hastily reassigned to oversee the property division, came to see her. Wicks was 32, uncomfortable with authority he hadn't expected, and he stood at the evidence room door and asked if she was doing all right. "I'm fine," she said, for what felt like the 100th time. He stayed in the doorway. "Some people are saying," he stopped, tried again, "there's some talk about who the source in the department might be, the U.S. attorney's source." She was standing at the filing cabinet. She had a folder in her hand. She looked at him. "Is there?" He looked at the floor, then back at her. I'm not saying it's accurate, I'm just saying. What do you need from me today, Sergeant? He didn't need anything from her, he left. The talk, as Wicks had carefully called it, reached her in fragments over the next 2 days. A patrol officer she barely knew gave her an evaluative look in the parking lot. Marcus, who had come to her with the news about Carso and who was not a bad person, was quieter than usual, and when he spoke he was careful with his words in the way people are careful when they're not sure whose side you're on. The woman from records, Carla, who was 63 years old and had seen everything, stopped by the evidence room for no apparent reason on the second day and sat in the chair by Renata's desk and said, "You doing okay?"
Yes.
Carla looked around the room. This place has needed cleaning out for a long time.
I know.
Not a lot of people would do it. Renata shrugged, someone had to. Carla nodded once, stood, and went back to records. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement she received from inside the building. It was enough. Pruitt's arrest happened on the morning of the 17th, simultaneously with Gaffney's, both at their homes. Renata was not there. She heard about it from the news the same as everyone else. There were photos, the kind that get taken when federal agents walk someone out the front door of their house, the particular visual grammar of a man in handcuffs and a sport coat looking at the sidewalk. Pruitt's face in the photo was not what she expected. She expected something harder. What she saw was just a man who looked tired and smaller than she remembered him, which was strange because she had seen him 2 days before and he had seemed his ordinary size. She studied the photo for longer than she meant to. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Whatever it was, she didn't find it. Mercer called her the morning after the arrests. "I want to prepare you for the next phase," she said. "Discovery is going to move fast on Carso, he's cooperating, and his counsel wants a deal on the table before the other 2 defendants have time to complicate things. That means your audit findings will become part of the formal record in the next 30 to 60 days, and your name will be in that record."
I understand.
The U.S. Attorney's Office has victim witness support available if.
I'm okay.
Just hear me out, there will likely be a period where you receive attention from the media. Local, possibly regional. The union may contact you, some of the defendant's supporters inside the department, and there will be some may attempt to discredit your findings or your character.
I know.
And you'll need to testify at some point, probably in federal court, about your audit methodology, your findings, the chain of custody on the documents you preserved. "I know how to testify about chain of custody," Renata said. "I've been doing it in state court for 14 years. A small pause. "Yeah," Mercer said, "I imagine you have." The Carso plea came through in April. He pleaded guilty to 8 of the 12 counts and agreed to cooperate fully. The cooperation agreement, which was a matter of public record, described a scheme that had begun approximately 22 months before Renata's audit, 18 months earlier than she had identified, meaning there were cases she hadn't found. The cooperation identified 3 additional cases. It described the mechanics of the scheme in bureaucratic detail, which bags Pruitt would select based on weight and case disposition, how the tape removal was done, a heat gun and a thin blade, replaced with tape from the same manufacturer kept in Pruitt's desk, which cases were chosen because the defendants were likely to plea rather than fight, which review visits were scheduled when Renata was at lunch or away from the desk. That last part stayed with her. They had timed the review visits around her schedule, which meant they had paid enough attention to her schedule to know it, which meant she had been in some operational sense the main obstacle, not the oversight board, not the supervisors, not the internal audit process. Just her presence in the room, her habits, the 45 minutes she took for lunch between noon and 12:45. She thought about that for a while. It wasn't flattering, exactly. It wasn't anything she could name without it sounding like she was assigning herself too much importance, but it was something. The Pruitt arraignment in federal court was on a Wednesday in early May. Renata did not attend. She sat in the property room and worked. At 12:30 she took her lunch break exactly as she always did and sat in the small room off the cage with a sandwich and a book she'd been reading for 3 weeks and wasn't sure she was actually reading, just holding. Marcus came in at 12:45 as he did when she returned from lunch. He didn't say anything about the arraignment, which had been the lead story on every local news channel that morning. He made coffee. He sat at his desk. After a while he said, The BCI is doing their own review, separate from the federal thing. They called this morning for some archive files.
I know, she said. I pulled them yesterday.
He nodded, typed something else.
For what it's worth, he said without looking at her, I think you did the right thing.
Thanks, Marcus.
He stopped. I know it's not been easy around here.
It's been okay.
He looked at her then. He had the expression of a person who wants to say something more direct and doesn't know how to say it. After a moment he went back to his screen. Okay, he said, good.
The Gaffney case was the complex one, the one the prosecutors wanted most and had built most carefully. Gaffney's lawyer filed 4 motions to dismiss over the spring, all denied. The conspiracy charge was the linchpin. It required proving not just that Gaffney had known, but that he had acted to prevent discovery, and the evidence for that was circumstantial but dense. The redirected BCI review request, 3 emails in which Gaffney discussed Renata's audit schedule in language that prosecutors argued demonstrated knowledge of the scheme. A financial analysis that showed a pattern of cash deposits in Gaffney's personal account that didn't correspond to his salary or known assets. Renata testified before the federal grand jury in June. She drove herself to Columbus, parked in the structure across from the courthouse, took the elevator up, and sat in a room with the AUSA and the grand jury and answered questions for an hour and 20 minutes. She was asked about her audit methodology, her findings, her process of documentation, her contact with Agent Mercer. She answered each question precisely and completely. She did not elaborate where elaboration wasn't asked for. She did not minimize anything. When she was asked how she had known that the tape on the evidence bags had been replaced, she explained what an adhesive shadow was and how you identify one. The AUSA had her explain it twice. Afterward, she went to a diner 2 blocks from the courthouse and had soup and coffee and sat at a window table and watched people walk by outside in the summer heat, and she felt something she could not entirely name, not relief, not pride, something quieter than either of those. Like a piece of heavy furniture that you've been moving slowly across a room has finally reached the wall. She drove home. She picked up Simone from volleyball practice. She made dinner. Simone talked about a conflict with a teammate, a thing about credit for a play, the unfairness of coaches who play favorites. Renata listened and said the appropriate things. She thought briefly about the concept of credit, about the specific experience of doing something that matters and having no one around you who understands the scale of what it cost. She didn't say any of this. She washed the dishes. She went to bed at 10:30. Pruitt's trial began the following February. Carso's cooperation was central. He testified over 2 days, calmly and in detail, with the somewhat flattened quality of a person who has gone over a thing so many times that it no longer produces emotion in them. He described the scheme in granular terms. He described Pruitt's instruction, given early in his 2nd year on the unit, about how the review process worked and why it was low risk. He described the heat gun, the replacement tape, the scale they kept in the trunk of Pruitt's car to measure what they'd taken so they could calculate the residual before resealing. He described splitting the meth. He described what they did with it, sold it, through a contact Carso identified but refused to name in open court per his cooperation agreement, someone 3 levels removed. He was not a broken man on the stand. He was not visibly remorseful in the theatrical sense. He answered questions in a flat, factual voice, and when the defense attorney on cross-examination suggested that he was fabricating to save himself, he said, "I made a deal because the evidence against me was overwhelming, not because I was fabricating." He said it without heat. Pruitt sat at the defense table through all of it with the expression of a man maintaining control of his face by significant effort. His lawyer was good, expensive, Columbus-based, someone who had done police defense work before, and knew how to frame law enforcement behavior as judgment calls and error rather than design. She worked at Carso's credibility, at the circumstantial nature of some of the forensic evidence, at the suggestion that the tape analysis was imprecise. Renata testified on the 4th day. She was on the stand for 3 hours. She described her audit methodology in the same patient, technical way she had described it to the grand jury, to Mercer, to the AUSA in the preparation sessions. She described the discrepancies. She described the tape. She described the pattern that emerged from the 12 cases. She spoke clearly and at measured pace and kept her hands in her lap. The defense cross-examination took 40 minutes.
The attorney was skilled and persistent, working at the margins, the possibility of calibration error, the interpretation of adhesive shadows, whether Renata had concluded that tampering had occurred before she had the evidence to support that conclusion. Renata did not take the bait on any of it. She answered what she was asked and did not add to her answers and did not get defensive, because she understood that defensiveness is where a cross-examination finds its leverage. At one point the defense attorney said, "You'd agree, Ms. Oakes, that your job is to manage evidence, not investigate it." Renata looked at her. "My job is to ensure the accuracy and integrity of everything in the property room. That's what the job description says." "But you're not a detective." "No. You're not trained in criminal investigation." "I'm trained in evidence management. What I found was an evidence management problem." "And you went to the FBI?" "I contacted the BCI Evidence Integrity Unit per a process outlined in the monthly reconciliation form. They referred me to the FBI." The attorney paused. "Did you want to get Detective Prout in trouble?" Renata looked at her. "I wanted the evidence room to be accurate." The attorney let a beat pass, nothing further. Prout was convicted on 19 of 22 counts. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Renata was not in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She was at work in Briar Falls in the property room processing intake on a batch of overnight arrests. Her phone buzzed at 11:42 with a text from Mercer, "Guilty, 19 counts. Sentencing in 90 days." She looked at the text. She put her phone in her pocket. She kept working. Gaffney pled guilty in April, 2 months after the Prout verdict, to a reduced charge of conspiracy and obstruction with a cooperation component. He received 4 years. His plea included a statement in which he said he had made choices he could not defend and that he understood the harm those choices had caused. It read like something his attorney had written, but it also read like something a man signs when he has accepted that the next chapter of his life is going to be very small. Prout was sentenced to 11 years. Federal time, he would serve at least 9. The department held a mandatory training session on evidence integrity in the spring. It was run by the BCI and lasted a full day. Renata was asked to contribute to the development of the updated protocol, which she did over 3 weeks of meetings with a BCI policy analyst named Torrance, who was thorough and younger than she expected and genuinely interested in the practical mechanics of how evidence rooms work. She got a commendation from the Briar Falls Police Department in the form of a letter from the acting chief, who had been brought in after a period of administrative reshuffling that had seen 2 captains and a deputy chief take early retirement. The letter was professionally phrased. She read it once and put it in the drawer of her desk at home. The FBI gave her nothing official. They thanked her in Mercer's careful language, and that was appropriate. She had not done what she did for acknowledgement. She received, over the following months, letters from other evidence clerks in other departments around Ohio and elsewhere, people who had read about the case and who wrote to say things that were careful and measured in their specificity, which told her that they each understood something about the weight of what she described because they worked in similar rooms and had perhaps considered similar things at some point. She answered each letter. She kept them brief. Simone found out the full extent of it the summer after the Prout sentencing. She'd known some version of it, the broad strokes, enough to understand why her mother had been more distracted than usual for the better part of a year and a half. But she'd looked up the case one night on her own and read the news coverage and the court record summaries and apparently sat with it for a few days before she came to her mother on a Sunday morning while Renata was drinking coffee at the kitchen table and said, "I read about the whole thing." Renata looked at her. Simone was 16 now, tall, with her father's eyes and Renata's way of standing when something matters to her, feet apart, weight even, like she's getting ready for something. "Okay," Renata said. "You didn't tell me how serious it was." "No." Simone was quiet for a moment. She got a glass of water from the sink and stood with it, looking out the window at the fence. "Were you scared?" Renata thought about it honestly. "I was careful," she said. "Careful and scared aren't always that different." Simone thought about that. She drank some of the water. She put the glass in the sink and looked at her mother with an expression Renata couldn't entirely read, not pride, not quite, more like the face of someone recalibrating something.
Okay, Simone said, and went back to her room. On a Thursday in June, 14 months after the initial arrest, Renata drove out to the Kroger parking lot not because she needed anything at Kroger, but because she found herself driving there out of habit, out of some pull that she only recognized when she was already turning into the lot. She parked in approximately the same spot where she'd made those calls. The store was busy summer morning, people loading groceries, a kid in a cart reaching for something on a low shelf while his mother wasn't looking. She sat for a while, no call to make, no case pending. The Gaffney sentencing had been the last formal proceeding she'd been involved in. Everything was filed, recorded, finished in the legal sense. The property room was running under updated protocols, a new audit schedule, 2 additional staff members that the department had been required to add as part of a consent agreement with the county. Marcus was doing well. Carla had started talking about retirement but hadn't moved on it yet. Renata looked at the grocery store. She looked at the parking lot. She thought about the morning she'd sat here and made the first call, the way her hands had felt on her phone, the man loading groceries into the minivan who hadn't known he was in the same frame as the beginning of something. She thought about the missing grams, 53 grams the first time she'd measured, the specific physical reality of what was not there, the scale reading the absence of something with perfect accuracy because a scale doesn't interpret, it only measures what's given to it. She started the car. She drove to the grocery store, went in, bought milk and coffee and the crackers Simone liked, and a bunch of bananas that were slightly more green than she preferred. She loaded them into the back of the Subaru and drove home through a June morning that was already warm, the kind of warm that in Ohio means the day will be heavy by afternoon. She unpacked the groceries, she put the coffee on, she stood at the kitchen window for a moment the way she did looking at the fence. Then she went about her day. And